The planet Veridin 4 was one of the most beautiful places humanity had ever touched. It was a world covered in forest. Not the kind of forest anyone on Earth would recognize, but something older, stranger, and far more alive. The trees stretched hundreds of meters into the sky, their trunks wide enough to build homes inside, their canopies glowing faintly at night, with pale blue and green bioluminescence. From orbit, the planet looked like a jewel wrapped in living light. Nestled in a valley between two ridgelines of ancient stone, sat a small human settlement called Briar Point. It was not much to look at. A few hundred prefabricated shelters arranged in neat rows. A water treatment plant that hummed day and night. A landing pad with cracks running through the concrete. One shuttle, old and patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of metal. And surrounding everything, a short fence that was meant more for keeping animals out than stopping anything serious. 800 people lived there. Farmers who had come looking for open land, researchers studying the alien plant life, families who wanted a quiet life far from the noise of the inner colonies. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and where the biggest problem on any given day was a broken irrigation pump or a power fluctuation in the grid. Jake Prescott had not come to Veridin 4 looking for quiet, but he had found it anyway. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of something hard and then softened slightly by time. He had served 12 years in the Colonial Marines before a piece of shrapnel in his left knee ended his career. The doctors had fixed the knee well enough for walking, but not for combat. So he had taken a transport to the furthest colony that would have him, and found himself in Briar Point, where they needed someone who could organize things and solve problems. They made him settlement foreman, which was a fancy title for the person everyone came to when something broke. Jake did not talk much about his years in the service. He did not need to. People could see it in the way he moved, the way he looked at a room and noticed the exits first, the way he stayed calm when others did not. He had the kind of steady presence that made people feel like things would be all right, even when they probably would not be. His second-in-command, though she would have hated that title, was Nora Gallagher. Nora was the colony's chief engineer, a woman in her late 30s with short red hair, grease-stained hands, and a tongue sharp enough to cut steel. She had built or rebuilt almost every piece of critical infrastructure in Briar Point using parts salvaged from the transport ship that had brought the first wave of colonists. That ship sat in a field 2 kilometers east of the settlement, slowly being taken apart, like a carcass being picked clean. Nora loved that ship the way a sculptor loves a block of marble, not for what it was, but for what she could turn it into. Then there was Cody Hartwell, the youngest person in any position of responsibility in the colony. He was 22, skinny, with dark curly hair that he never seemed to comb, and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers on whatever surface was closest. Cody was the communications officer, which meant he spent most of his time alone in a small room full of old screens and blinking lights, monitoring signals from orbit and keeping the colony's link to the wider galaxy alive. It was boring work, and Cody often complained about it, but he was good at it in the way that people who are slightly obsessive about details tend to be good at technical jobs. The colony's chief medic was Maggie Dunn, a woman in her 50s who had worked frontier medicine for longer than most of the colonists had been alive. She had set bones on mining platforms, delivered babies in cargo holds, and once performed an emergency surgery using a kitchen knife and a bottle of engine coolant as disinfectant. Nothing surprised Maggie anymore. She had a calm, dry way of speaking that made even terrible news sound manageable, and she kept a small garden of herbs behind the medbay that she tended every morning before dawn. These 4 people, along with the 800 souls who lived in their care, had built something good on Veridin 4. It was small and fragile and far from perfect, but it was theirs. The days had a rhythm to them. Morning light filtering through the glowing canopy, the sound of machinery and laughter, Children running between the shelters, the smell of alien soil being turned for planting. They had been told this sector was safe. The nearest naval outpost was 9 days away by faster-than-light relay. But that had never seemed like a problem. There was nothing out here worth fighting over. Or so everyone believed. Veradin 4 was too remote, too small, too unimportant. It was just a forest world with a handful of humans trying to grow food and raise families. That changed on a Tuesday. Cody was sitting in his communications room, half asleep, when his console began to chirp. It was a signal, faint, repeating, coming from somewhere in high orbit. He sat up and adjusted the frequency. The signal was not human. It did not match any known species in the local communications registry. It was structured and deliberate, which meant it was not natural. Someone was up there, and they were talking to each other. Cody's fingers stopped tapping. His mouth went dry. He ran the signal through every filter he had, trying to clean it up, trying to identify it. Nothing matched. He recorded 30 seconds of it, and then ran to find Jake. He found him in the equipment shed, helping a farmer fix a plow. Cody did not even wait for the farmer to leave. He held up his datapad and played the signal. Jake listened. His face did not change, but his eyes did. Something behind them went very still. "How long has this been broadcasting?" Jake asked. "I don't know. Maybe hours, maybe longer. I only caught it because I was cycling through the upper bands." Jake looked at Nora, who had wandered over when she heard the commotion. She took the datapad, studied the waveform, and said nothing for a long moment. "That's not a survey probe," she said finally. "That's fleet chatter." Before anyone could respond, the light changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the color of the sky above the tree line, like the sun was setting in the wrong direction. Then it deepened. The pale blue glow of the forest canopy was drowned out by something fierce and orange, something hot and wrong. Jake stepped outside the shed and looked up. The sky above the forest to the north was on fire. Not burning in the way that clouds sometimes caught the light of a sunset. Burning the way things burn when something has decided they should not exist anymore. He turned to Cody. "Get to the comm room, send a distress signal on every channel we have. Now." Cody ran. Jake looked at Nora. She was already doing math in her head, and he could tell from her face that the numbers were not good. The forest was burning, and it was coming toward them. The fire did not spread the way a natural fire would. A natural fire was messy and unpredictable, driven by wind and dry ground and chance. This fire moved in a circle. It started at the edges of the region and burned inward, tightening like a noose. From the ground, it looked like the entire horizon was glowing. From orbit, it would have looked like a ring of light, slowly closing around a single point, Briar Point. Jake stood on the roof of the equipment shed and watched the glow creep closer from every direction. The heat was already reaching them, carried on a wind that smelled like burning metal and scorched earth. Ash was beginning to fall like gray snow. Within an hour, Nora had the answer he did not want to hear. She had climbed the colony's radio tower with a pair of binoculars and a thermal scanner, and taken measurements from every direction. She came back down with soot on her face and a look in her eyes that Jake had only seen once before, during a reactor leak 3 years ago. "It's a ring," she said, "perfectly circular, roughly 60 kilometers in diameter, and we're in the center. It's burning inward at about 2 kilometers per hour, which means it reaches us in 14 hours, give or take." "That's not a forest fire," Jake said. "No, that's a weapon." The confirmation came not from Nora, but from the sky itself. As the colonists gathered in the open square between the shelters, looking up at the orange glow that had swallowed the stars, shapes began to appear through the smoke. Long, dark silhouettes moving slowly across the upper atmosphere. Ships, dozens of them. They were not human. Cody, working frantically in his comm room, managed to intercept fragments of their communications before they shifted frequencies. The language was clicking and layered, like stones being tapped together in complex patterns. He ran it through the colony's translation database and got a partial match. Vethari. The name meant nothing to most of the colonists, but Jake knew it. Every Marine knew it. The Vethari were an insectoid species that had been expanding aggressively along the outer rim for decades. They conquered worlds, not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through a method that was brutally simple. They burned the surface. They stripped the biomass. They moved in. 19 species had fallen to them. Not one had successfully resisted once the burning phase began. The burning was not destruction for its own sake. It was doctrine. The Vethari believed that the first step in taking a world was to remove every piece of cover, every resource, every advantage that a defending species might use. They turned forests into ash fields, oceans into steam, grasslands into glass. And then, once the world was bare, and the defenders were choking and blind and terrified, the ground troops came. It had worked every single time. Jake called a meeting in the colony's mess hall. Every adult who could walk was there. The room was hot, and the air was getting worse. Children had been moved to the underground storage bunkers, where the air was still clean. Maggie was already setting up a medical station down there, moving supplies with a calm efficiency that kept people from panicking more than they already were. Jake stood on a table so everyone could see him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Here is what we know," he said. "An alien fleet is in orbit. They are burning the forest around us in a closing circle. Based on what we know about this species, ground troops will follow once the fire has passed. We have one shuttle, and it is damaged. A landing pad is already too hot to use. Our relay satellite has been destroyed, but Cody managed to send a distress signal before it went down. We do not know if anyone received it." The room was silent. 800 people staring at him, waiting. "We have 43 people in the militia. We have rifles, ammunition, and whatever Nora can build for us in the next 12 hours. We do not have enough of anything. We do not have reinforcements. We do not have a way off this planet." Someone in the back of the room asked the question everyone was thinking. "So what do we do?" Jake looked at them. Farmers, engineers, teachers, parents. People who had come here to build a life, not fight a war. He thought about all the things a leader was supposed to say in a moment like this. Something inspiring, something grand. But Jake was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who fixed plows, and patched roofs, and told the truth, even when it was ugly. "We fight," he said, "in whatever is left after the fire passes through." The room erupted. Some people shouted in agreement. Others shouted in fear. A few were crying. Jake let them have their moment, and then raised his hand. "I am not going to lie to you. This is bad. But these things, the Vethari, they burn the world because they expect that to be enough. They expect us to run. They expect us to fall apart. Every species they have done this to has given them exactly what they expected. So we are going to do the one thing they have no plan for. We are going to stay." He stepped down from the table and walked to where Nora was standing with her arms crossed. She looked at him with one eyebrow raised. "You know this is insane," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Good. Just making sure we're on the same page." She cracked her knuckles. "I'll need every battery, every capacitor, and every meter of copper wire in this colony. And someone get me the power coupling from the shuttle. If we're going to fight in a wasteland, I'm going to make sure we have at least one surprise for them." Jake turned to Cody. "Keep broadcasting. Every frequency. Every minute. If that signal got through, someone might be coming. We just need to give them something to come to." Cody nodded. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. Maggie appeared at Jake's side. She had a bag over her shoulder and ash in her hair. "The underground bunkers can hold the children and the wounded, but the air filtration down there will only last about 20 hours before the filters clog. After that, we are breathing smoke." Then we'd better win in less than 20 hours, Jake said. Maggie gave him a look that was half disapproval and half something that might have been respect. I'll need volunteers to help move medical supplies. And Jake, when the fighting starts, I'll need your people to bring the wounded to me, not leave them in the field. I have lost enough patience on frontier worlds. I will not lose more because someone decided a body was too heavy to carry. Outside, the glow was brighter now. The heat was a physical thing, pressing against the walls of the shelters like a hand. Ash was piling up on every flat surface. The beautiful glowing forest that had surrounded Briar Point for as long as anyone could remember was dying, and the sound of it was terrible. A deep rolling roar that never stopped, like the planet itself was screaming. Jake stood outside alone for a moment and watched the firewall creep closer. Somewhere behind that wall of flame, an alien army was waiting for the ashes to cool. They had done this before. They were good at it. They had never lost. He took a breath of hot, dirty air and went back inside to prepare. They want ashes, he said quietly to himself. Fine. We know how to live in the dirt. The fire passed through Briar Point at dawn. It came not as a single wave, but as a crawling wall of heat and light that ate everything it touched. The colonists huddled underground, pressed together in the storage bunkers, while the world above them roared. The temperature inside the bunkers climbed until the metal walls were too hot to touch. Children cried. Adults held them and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They could only wait and hope that the shelters Nora had reinforced with heat shielding, stripped from the old shuttle, would hold. They held. Barely. When Jake climbed out of the bunker hatch 2 hours later, he did not recognize the world he stepped into. The forest was gone. Every tree, every vine, every glowing leaf, all of it was gone. In its place was a flat gray wasteland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Charred stumps jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The soil itself had been baked into something hard and cracked. Smoke rose from everything. The air was so thick with ash that the sun was just a dull red smear behind a gray sky. Briar Point still stood, but only in the loosest sense of the word. Half the shelters had collapsed. The equipment shed was a skeleton of blackened metal. The landing pad was warped and buckled. The fence was gone entirely. What remained looked less like a settlement and more like a wound in the earth. Jake pulled a cloth over his nose and mouth and started walking the perimeter. One by one, the others emerged. They moved slowly, blinking against the ash, coughing, staring at the devastation with the hollow eyes of people who had just lost everything familiar. Nora was one of the first out. She took one look at the wasteland, and then, in a voice that was almost cheerful, said, "Well, at least we have clear sightlines now." And that single observation changed everything. The Vithari burned the forest to deny cover to their enemies. But cover worked both ways. Without the forest, there was nowhere for the Vithari to hide either. The ash flats were open ground, kilometers of flat, bare terrain where anything moving could be seen from a long distance. And human-made kinetic rifles, even old ones, were accurate at range across open ground. Jake saw it immediately. The Vithari had given them a killing field. Within hours, the colony was transformed from a settlement into a fortress. Jake organized the militia into fire teams of 4 and assigned each team a section of the perimeter. Nora directed the non-combatants in digging trenches using the colony's construction equipment. The soil was hot, but soft enough to move once the top crust was broken. They dug fast and deep, piling the displaced earth into barriers. Nora herself was working on something bigger. She had spent the last 12 hours before the fire building a device from the colony's main power grid. A crude electromagnetic pulse emitter that could, in theory, disable Vithari electronics within a 200-meter radius. It was ugly, dangerous, and had a good chance of exploding when activated. Nora loved it. Cody, meanwhile, had dragged his communication equipment into one of the surviving bunkers and was working on something of his own. Using parts from the damaged shuttle's navigation system, he had built a short-range signal jammer. If the Vithari ground troops used coordinated communications, and every report on them said they did, this device could scramble those signals and turn their organized assault into a confused mess. At least for a while. At least once. Maggie had turned the deepest bunker into a field hospital. She had organized the non-combatants who were not digging trenches into medical teams. Runners who would carry the wounded from the field to her station. Assistants who could hold a bandage or pass a tool. She was calm and methodical, laying out her instruments on a clean cloth, while the ceiling above her creaked with heat. By midday, they were as ready as they were ever going to be. The Vethari came at noon. The first sign was a sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping that came from everywhere at once, carried across the flat ash plains. Then the dropships appeared, descending through the smoke in tight formations. They were angular and dark, built like insects themselves, and they landed in a wide arc, roughly 3 kilometers from the colony. The doors opened, and the Vethari poured out. They were tall, taller than humans, with hard, segmented bodies that were somewhere between armor and skin. They moved on 4 legs, with a speed and precision that was mechanical in its perfection. Each one carried a weapon that fired concentrated bursts of superheated plasma. There were thousands of them, row after row after row, advancing across the ash in perfect formation. Jake watched them through the scope of his rifle from the forward trench. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. Beside him, a farmer named Pete Loomis was gripping his own rifle so hard his knuckles were white. "They don't look like they're expecting a fight," Pete said. "They're not," Jake replied. "That's the only advantage we've got. Don't waste it." He waited until the first wave was within 800 meters, and then gave the order. 43 rifles fired at once. The sound cracked across the ash flats like thunder. The first rank of Vethari soldiers stumbled and fell. The second rank hesitated, just for a moment, but it was a moment that mattered. The humans fired again. And again. The Vethari regrouped quickly. They were professional soldiers, and they adapted. They spread out, lowered their profiles, and began returning fire. Plasma bolts screamed across the ash, turning the ground to glass wherever they hit. A trench wall exploded 20 meters to Jake's left. Someone screamed. But the humans held. Nora activated the EMP device when a cluster of Vethari heavy units advanced on the eastern flank. The pulse was invisible, but its effect was immediate. Vethari weapons went dead. Their communication signals dissolved into static. For 30 seconds, an entire section of the alien line was blind, deaf, and unarmed. The militia fire teams on that flank cut them apart. Cody triggered his jammer during the second push, scrambling Vethari coordination signals across the central front. Units that had been moving in perfect sync suddenly stumbled over each other, broke formation, and stalled. Human rifles found them in the open. The Vethari had never seen this before. Their doctrine said that once the burning was done, resistance collapsed. Every species they had ever conquered had broken at this point, fled, surrendered, or simply died in the smoke. They had no contingency for an enemy that dug in and fought back in the very wasteland the burning had created. But the cost was real. The colonists were taking hits. Plasma burns were devastating. Maggie's field hospital was filling up fast. A militia volunteer named Eddie Soto, 24 years old and barely trained, found himself alone in a forward trench when his squad was ordered to pull back to a secondary position. The Vethari were advancing on his section, and if that trench fell, it would open a gap in the line wide enough for them to pour through. Eddie stayed. He did not decide to be brave. There was no time for a decision like that. He simply did not leave. He fired and reloaded, and fired again, keeping his head below the trench wall between shots, counting his ammunition in his head, because counting was the only thing that kept him from thinking about how afraid he was. 40 minutes. He held that trench for 40 minutes alone, while Nora repositioned the EMP device to cover the gap. When the relief team finally reached him, he had 7 rounds left, and a burn on his right arm that went down to the bone. He was shaking so badly he could not stand on his own. Maggie treated his arm in the field hospital, and told him he was either the bravest or the stupidest person she had ever met. Eddie said he was pretty sure it was the second one. Maggie almost smiled. By nightfall, the Vithari assault had stalled. They had taken ground, the outer ring of trenches was lost, but they had paid for every meter of it. The ash flats were littered with the bodies of their soldiers. Their field commander, watching from orbit, sent a message to the fleet. The message, which Cody intercepted and partially translated, said something that had never appeared in a Vithari combat report before. It said, "The prey is not running. Request reinforcement." Jake heard this and felt nothing like relief. Reinforcements meant a second wave, a bigger one, and the colony had spent almost half its ammunition in a single day. He sat in the command bunker, covered in ash and sweat, and looked at the map Nora had drawn on the wall. Their shrinking perimeter, the positions of the enemy, the dwindling supply counts. "We held today," Nora said, sitting across from him. "That's more than anyone has ever done against these things." "Today isn't enough," Jake said. "We need tomorrow too, and the day after that." Nora nodded. "Then we change the game. Stop being defenders. Start being a problem." She was already grinning. And it was the kind of grin that meant she had an idea that was either brilliant or catastrophically dangerous. Knowing Nora, it was probably both. It was Cody who heard it first. He was sitting in his bunker, surrounded by gutted equipment and tangled wires, cycling through every frequency he could reach, when a sound cut through the static that made his heart stop and then start again twice as fast. It was faint, it was broken, but it was unmistakably human. A return signal. He grabbed the recording, cleaned it up as best he could, and ran through the ash-covered ruins of the colony to the command bunker where Jake and Nora were planning the night's operations. He burst through the door, out of breath, and played it without saying a word. The message was fragmented, but the meaning was clear. A human naval task force had received the distress burst. They were coming. The lead ship was a destroyer called the Pale Horse, under the command of Commander Lisa Wynn. They were burning hard toward Veradin 4 at maximum speed. But they were 31 hours away. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment after the message ended. 31 hours. It might as well have been 31 years, given what they were facing. Jake did the math quietly in his head, the way he always did. No drama, just numbers. They had enough ammunition for roughly 12 more hours of sustained fighting at the rate they had been burning through it. Nora's EMP device had enough charge in its capacitors for 1, maybe 2 more full discharges before the system burned out permanently. The water supply was running low because the purification plant had been damaged in the fire. Maggie, medical supplies were being consumed faster than anyone had planned for. Plasma burns required enormous amounts of burn gel and bandaging, and she was already improvising with whatever she could find. And the Vithari reinforcements were coming. "We can't hold this perimeter for 31 hours in a straight defensive fight," Nora said. She was not being pessimistic, she was being accurate, and everyone in the room knew it. Jake nodded. "Then we don't fight a straight defensive fight." The plan came together in the cold hours before midnight. Instead of sitting behind their trenches and waiting for the next wave, they would go out into the ash wastes and bring the war to the Vithari. Small teams, fast, silent, moving through the dark, across terrain that was still warm enough to mask their heat signatures from alien sensors. They would hit supply lines, destroy grounded dropships, and create as much confusion and damage as possible. The goal was not to win. It was to make the Vethari think they were facing something larger and more dangerous than 43 exhausted colonists with old rifles. Nora insisted on leading one of the teams herself. Jake tried to argue, but she shut him down with a look that could have melted steel. "You need me out there," she said. "I'm the only one who knows how to build a thermite charge from welding supplies. And I'm the only one crazy enough to crawl 2 kilometers through hot ash to deliver it personally." She took 3 volunteers, a farmer named Danny Greer, a water technician named Rosa Vega, and a young mechanic named Hank Pruitt, who had never fired a weapon before yesterday. They blacked their faces with ash, strapped whatever explosives Nora had cobbled together to their backs, and slipped out of the perimeter at 2 in the morning. The ash wastes at night were an alien landscape. The ground was still warm, almost hot, and it crunched softly underfoot. Smoke drifted in low banks that reduced visibility to a few meters. The sky was invisible behind a ceiling of haze. The only light came from the distant glow of Vethari encampments and the occasional flicker of orbital engines high above. Nora led her team in a wide arc to the east, staying low, moving slowly. They communicated with hand signals only. Every few minutes, they would stop and listen, and the silence was so deep it felt like the world had ended, and they were the only ones left. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach their target, a Vethari troop carrier grounded on a flat stretch of ash, roughly 2 kilometers from the colony. It was a massive thing, dark and angular, with its doors still open, and the faint blue glow of interior lights spilling out onto the gray ground. There were guards, but not many. The Vethari did not expect threats from the wasteland they had created. Nothing was supposed to survive out here. Nora placed her charges carefully. The thermite compound she had mixed was unstable and powerful. Once ignited, it would burn through the carrier's hull in seconds and reach the fuel stores within. She set a 60-second delay, tapped Danny on the shoulder, and they ran. The explosion lit up the ash plains like a second sunrise. A column of fire roared into the sky, and the shock wave rolled across the flat ground like a wave. From 2 kilometers away, the colonists at Briar Point saw it. They cheered, a ragged, exhausted cheer, but real. Nora's team made it back to the perimeter by dawn, covered in ash and burns, and grinning like maniacs. Hank Pruitt, who had been trembling with fear for the entire mission, sat down in a trench and laughed until he cried. But the dawn also brought the second wave. It was larger than the first. The drop ships came in 3 formations, landing in a tighter ring around the colony. The Vethari had adjusted their approach. More troops, heavier weapons, faster advance. They were angry now. The colonists could hear it in the way they moved, the way their plasma weapons fired in rapid, aggressive bursts, rather than the measured volleys of the day before. The line buckled within the first hour. The eastern perimeter, which had been weakened the day before, collapsed entirely when a concentrated Vethari assault overwhelmed the fire team holding it. 3 militia volunteers were killed. The rest fell back to the secondary trenches, and suddenly there was a gap in the defense wide enough for the Vethari to exploit. Maggie heard the shouting from her field hospital and knew what it meant. She had been a medic her entire adult life. She had never held a weapon in combat. But when the first Vethari soldier appeared at the end of the corridor, leading to her patients, she picked up a rifle that a wounded volunteer could no longer hold, pressed it against her shoulder the way she had seen Jake's militia do it, and fired. The shot hit the Vethari in the chest and knocked it backward. Maggie fired again, and again. She held that corridor for 4 minutes until a fire team arrived to reinforce the position. When it was over, she put the rifle down, washed the ash off her hands, and went back to treating a patient with a plasma burn on his leg. Her hands did not shake. She did not allow them to. On the other side of the perimeter, Eddie Soto was back on his feet, despite Maggie's orders. His right arm was wrapped in bandages, from shoulder to wrist, and he could not hold his rifle properly, so he held it with his left hand and braced it against a trench wall. He found 11 other volunteers, some wounded, some simply terrified, and organized them into something that was not quite a squad, but was close enough. "We need that eastern trench back," he told them. "If they hold it, they'll flank the whole line, so we're going to take it." Nobody argued. Maybe they were too tired to argue. Maybe they looked at this kid with his burned arm and his borrowed rifle and saw something worth following. Either way, they went. The countercharge was fast and brutal. 12 colonists running across open ash ground, firing as they moved, screaming, not because they were brave, but because screaming was the only way to keep moving when every part of your body was telling you to stop. The Vathari in the trench were not prepared for it. They had been setting up a forward position, expecting the humans to keep falling back. They did not expect the humans to come toward them. 5 of the 12 did not come back. By hour 28, the colony had been pushed back to a core perimeter roughly 300 meters across. It was everything they had left: the bunkers, the remains of the medbay, a handful of trenches and barricades made from wrecked shelters. Jake had taken a piece of shrapnel in his side during a Vathari push on the northern line. Nora had bandaged it with a strip torn from her own jacket and told him to stop bleeding on her equipment. Jake could no longer stand for long, so he sat on a crate in the command bunker and directed the defense from there. Nora was outside, running from position to position, patching gaps, redirecting fire, keeping people alive through sheer force of will. Cody was in his bunker, broadcasting on every frequency he could reach. The same message, over and over, repeating their position, their situation, their numbers. He did not know if anyone was listening. He broadcast anyway. "This is Briar Point Colony, Veradin 4. We are under attack. We are still here. If anyone can hear this, we are still here." The clock in his bunker read hour 29. 2 more hours, if the message was real, if the fleet was coming, if they could last that long. Outside, the Vathari were massing for what looked like a final push. Jake could see it on the crude sensor display Nora had rigged. A dark wave of signatures gathering at the edge of their perimeter, more than they had seen at any point in the battle. He looked at the display for a long time. Then he looked at Nora, who had come back inside with blood on her hands that was not hers. "One more round," he said. Nora nodded. "One more round." Hour 30. The Vathari final assault began with a sound that none of the surviving colonists would ever forget. A low, vibrating hum that came from thousands of alien soldiers activating their weapons at the same moment. It rolled across the ash flats like a wave, and it was the sound of something that expected to end this. The Vathari had lost patience. They had lost soldiers. They had lost time. And they had lost something that mattered more to their kind than any of those things. They had lost certainty. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the outcome of a burning phase operation was not guaranteed, and that fact enraged them. They came from every direction at once, not in waves this time, but in a single overwhelming tide. The ash plains turned dark with their bodies, thousands of segmented forms moving with terrible speed across the open ground. Plasma fire lit the gray air in streaks of blue and white. The ground shook with the rhythm of their advance. Jake was on the line. He had refused to stay in the command bunker. Nora had argued. Maggie had argued harder. He had ignored them both, picked up his rifle with his good arm, and walked to the forward trench with the slow, steady gait of a man who had made peace with whatever was about to happen. "If this is the last stand," he told Nora, "I'm not taking it sitting down." The perimeter was 300 meters of trenches, barricades, and rubble. 31 defenders were still able to fight. Some were wounded, some were shaking with exhaustion. A few were civilians who had never held a rifle before 2 days ago, and now held them like they had been born with them. They fired. The Vethari fell. More came. They fired again. The ammunition counters dropped. Jake called targets in a calm, flat voice that cut through the noise of battle, like a blade. Nora moved behind the line, carrying ammunition boxes, patching damaged weapons, dragging wounded fighters to cover with a strength that should not have been possible for a woman who had not slept in 40 hours. Eddie Soto was on the eastern trench again. His arm had stopped hurting sometime during the night. Maggie said that was not a good sign. But Eddie did not care. He had 5 rounds left, and a captured Vethari plasma weapon that he had figured out how to fire by trial and error. He used the human rifle until it was empty, and then switched to the alien weapon, which kicked harder than anything he had ever held, and left burns on his palm every time he pulled the trigger. The line bent. It buckled. A section of the southern barricade was overrun. 2 militia volunteers were killed. The Vethari poured through the gap, and for a terrible moment, it looked like it was over. Nora fired the EMP device for the last time. She had been saving the final charge for exactly this moment. The pulse ripped through the Vethari breakthrough force, killing their weapons, their communications, their coordination. They stumbled, blind and silent, and the colonists cut them down with rifle fire, and when the rifles were empty, with tools and fists and anything else they could swing. The gap was sealed, but the EMP was dead. The capacitors had burned out, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the device like a funeral pyre. Cody was still broadcasting. His voice was hoarse and cracking, but he had not stopped. He had not stopped for 30 hours. The same message, over and over, on every frequency. He did not know if the fleet was still coming. He did not know if the signal had been real. He did not know if they had imagined hope because they needed it too badly to question it. This is Briar Point Colony. We are still here. We are still here. Minute 14. And then the sky broke open. It came as a flash of light, so intense that every person on the ground, human and Vethari alike, stopped and looked up. The clouds of smoke and ash above them split apart as if something had torn through them at impossible speed, and through the gap fell a shape that was sharp and gray and unmistakably human in design. The pale horse dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the atmosphere. It was a maneuver so reckless that the friction alone scorched the paint off her hull and turned her forward sensor arrays into melted slag. No captain in the fleet would have approved it. No navigation computer would have recommended it. Commander Lisa Nguyen had done it anyway. The destroyer came in hot, her weapons already firing before she had finished decelerating. The first salvo struck a Vethari cruiser in low orbit and broke it in half. The second salvo caught another as it tried to turn away. 2 warships, each larger than the Pale Horse, destroyed in less than a minute. Behind the Pale Horse came her escorts, 2 frigates and a corvette, smaller and faster, diving into the orbital space above Veridin 4 with their weapons blazing. The Vethari fleet, which had been sitting in comfortable orbit, expecting no resistance from space, was caught completely off guard. Ships scrambled to raise shields and return fire, but the human task force had the advantage of speed, surprise, and a commander who had thrown the rulebook out the airlock somewhere around hour 20 of the burn toward Veridin 4. The orbital thermal lances, the massive weapons that had burned the forest, went silent as the ships carrying them were destroyed or forced to flee. For the first time in 2 days, nothing was burning on Veridin 4 except what had already been burned. On the ground, the Vethari felt it. Their communications with the fleet collapsed. The steady stream of orders from their orbital commanders dissolved into static and silence. For a species that operated on rigid hierarchical coordination, it was devastating. Units that had been advancing in perfect order slowed, stopped, and began to mill in confusion. And then the dropships came. The Pale Horse carried a Marine complement of 200. Commander Nguyen deployed every single one of them. The dropships screamed down through the smoke and ash and hit the ground in a wide arc behind the Vethari assault force. 200 fresh, armed, rested Marines slammed into the rear of an enemy that was already confused and rattled. The effect was immediate and total. Caught between the entrenched colonists in front of them and the Marines behind them, the Vethari ground force shattered. Units broke and fled across the ash plains. Others threw down their weapons, something that, according to every intelligence file on the species, Vethari soldiers simply did not do. The impossible had become possible. The unbeatable had been beaten. The fighting did not end all at once. There were pockets of resistance. There were ugly, close-range engagements in the trenches and ruins of Briar Point that lasted into the afternoon. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. By sunset, the battle was over. Commander Nguyen came down on one of the last dropships. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes, and the kind of expression that suggested she had been angry since birth, and had simply learned to make it productive. She walked through the ruins of Briar Point with 2 Marine officers at her side, stepping over rubble and wreckage and the still warm bodies of Vethari soldiers. She found Jake sitting on an overturned supply crate near what had been the command bunker. His arm was in a sling that Maggie had fashioned from a piece of shelter fabric. His face was gray with ash. He looked like a man who had been fighting for 2 days straight, because he was. Nguyen stood in front of him and looked around at the devastation. The trenches, the barricades, the improvised weapons, the impossible defense that 43 colonists had mounted against a force that had conquered 19 species. How? She asked. It was not a formal question. It was the question of a professional soldier looking at something that should not have been possible. Jake looked at the ash-covered wasteland that had once been a forest. The gray expanse stretched to the horizon in every direction, scarred with craters and trenches and the wreckage of alien war machines. Smoke still rose from a dozen places. The air still tasted like the end of the world. He looked back at Nguyen. They burned everything we could hide behind, he said. So we stopped hiding. Nguyen stared at him for a long moment, and then nodded once, the way one soldier nods to another when words are not enough. In the days that followed, the colony began to breathe again. The Marine engineers helped stabilize the remaining structures. Medical teams from the Pale Horse reinforced Maggie's field hospital. Supplies were shuttled down from orbit. The air slowly began to clear as the last of the fires died out across the continent. Nora was already drawing plans. She sat on a piece of wreckage with a datapad on her knee, sketching the layout of a new perimeter wall. Bigger, stronger, and designed with defensive positions built into its structure. When someone asked her why she was planning a wall when there was nothing left to protect, she looked at them as if they had said something profoundly stupid. Give it time. Maggie moved her medical operation into a captured Vethari shelter that had survived the battle intact. It was larger than her old medbay and had better ventilation. She kept her little herb garden going in a pot of imported soil, set on a shelf where it caught what little sunlight filtered through the haze. Cody finally stopped broadcasting. He sat in his bunker for a long time after the fighting ended, staring at his equipment, his hands still and quiet for the first time in days. Then he went outside, sat in the ash, and watched the sky turn colors he had never seen before, deep reds and purples and golds, painted by the particles of a burned world catching the light of its star. Eddie Soto was promoted to militia sergeant, a rank that did not officially exist in a colony this small, but that Jake created specifically for him. Eddie accepted it with a shrug, and said he would have preferred a new arm. Maggie told him his arm would be fine in 6 weeks. Eddie said that was easy for her to say, since she was not the one who had to eat left-handed. The Vithari did not return to Veridin 4. The Battle of Briar Point sent a shockwave through their command structure that was felt for years. Their doctrine of burn and advance, which had been the foundation of their expansion for generations, had been broken by a species that had done the one thing no other species had ever done: stayed in the fire and fought. Within 2 years, a human-led coalition of species that had suffered under Vethari aggression pushed them back beyond the frontier line. The coalition's battle cry, adopted from a phrase that had spread across the galaxy after the events on Veridin 4, was simple: "We are still here." The forest on Veridin 4 never grew back the way it had been. The bioluminescent trees were gone, and whatever had made them glow was lost with them. New growth came slowly. Tough, scrubby plants that pushed through the ash over months and years. Nothing like the towering canopy that had once covered the world. It was a different kind of life, harder and plainer, but it was life. The colony grew with it. New colonists came. New buildings went up. Children were born who had never seen the old forest, and who knew the ash plains not as a scar, but simply as home. The settlement expanded beyond its original boundaries, spreading across the land that the fire had cleared. They named the new settlement Ashfield, and in the center of it, in a small square surrounded by new buildings and young trees, they placed a simple stone marker. It bore no grand inscription, no list of battles or speeches, just 6 words, carved deep enough to last. They burned it. We stayed.